sending out Shuko to see how much of the army was out there. At the entrance, Kalki had left for Madira's chalais, where everyone had gathered. There were other elders as well. The entire tavern was filled with the village folks, some worried, while some were ranting about giving up the battle. When they all saw Kalki and Lakshmi coming together, their voices grew silent. Kalki walked forward, his arms by his side, while his impassive face swiveled to see everyone from the village. They were all frightened, worried, almost on the verge of hopeless fear. Kalki said, "I don't want to impose my will, but if you care about this village, detest those monsters that stand outside, and then go to Indravan, stand outside the caves, and don't let them destroy it." "What if they kill us?" one of them asked. "They won't." Kalki licked his dry lips, his hands shaking even as he sought to continue. "If you all stand together." Another one shouted from the crowd, "Will you win?" Kalki sighed. That was a scary question. He wanted to be honest and tell them it was difficult, but his hands were clasped by another pair of hands, warm and soft. They were of Lakshmi's, who gave him an acknowledging nod. Yes. Kalki had a surge of energy inside him. The very fact that we don't believe we will win is exactly why we will lose. We must begin to believe, in the most optimistic way, that we will rise from this darkness and beat the monsters who decided to take away our tradition. No one uttered another word. Silence began to creep in. Kalki didn't like it. It meant they had begun to believe in him. That's what he wanted, right? Why did he immediately fear this hope towards him? Why was he so afraid of taking a responsibility? The lives of many people now rested on him, many families and their children looked up to him. They believed he could do it. The pressure was intense. There was a little part of him that felt he should go back in time and not stand on the pedestal, proclaiming his adversarial attitude towards the city royals. He was just a village boy from a small place. Perhaps he had dreamt too big. No, he couldn't have these thoughts. He tightly cupped his hands with Lakshmi's and gave a nod at the village folks before moving inside. Time changed people, but our choices dictated whether it was for the better or for the worse. The inside of the tavern was haphazard. Half were climbing the stairs carrying boulders, rocks and weapons, while others were mapping out, standing close to the fire lamps and candles. The smell of sweat and the palpable adrenaline was overpowering. Each volunteer gave a nod at Kalki. It was a sign of respect and admiration. He had gained a lot of that over these period of days, but they were all so young, so naive. Would they be able to fight? He reached the main room, where Arindam sat silently in the corner. Kripa was leaning forward and tracing the map that was placed on the center table. Devdatta was there with Arjun and Bala as well. Arjun had a new weapon, a bow and arrow, a fit choice for a lad like him. Bala had a make now, heavier than him, but he carried it effortlessly. Devdatta didn't carry anything, just like Kripa. He had said to Kalki, Shambhala was a village where weapons were an extraordinary overture. There was no armory in Shambhala, as it was an agricultural village. Things had changed now, of course. Where were you, mate? Kripa said. Kalki left Lakshmi's hand and made his way around the table. All right, what do we see? What does your parrot see? He hadn't returned till now. Was he hit by an arrow? He hoped not. We checked from the top of this inn. Arjun spoke aloud, silencing the others. The entrance of the village is blocked completely. There are tents erected in the forest. The army, well, they are quite different from what we had expected. Do they have snakes on their breastplates? Kalki recalled how there were Nagas policing the streets in Indragarh. Perhaps they would have come all the way. No. In fact, there was no symbol at all, just armor, and some of them, if I recall, didn't have any armor at all. Lakshmi sat on the ground instantly, as if she had heard some terrible news. Kalki came to her rescue as he held her arm. What happened? No symbols, which means they don't follow a god of their own, Lakshmi said. That means, Rakshas, ended Kripa, with his voice grave and hoarse. No, gasped Devdutt, as he cowered against the wall. Kalki knew why everyone was worried. The most fascinating part about Gurukul was the fact that he had learnt about the Tiavanbialis, the once homogeneous race that coexisted with Manavs, but who had long since been disbanded. One of the foremost men who had begun the rebellion for his fight for survival was King Dashanan of Elam, down in the south. He was the same man Kalki had seen when he had channeled and gone back in time. He was the man who was exiting a flying machine. Rakshas, in the most realistic term, were ravagers. They didn't care, they didn't mind. They would eat their own after killing them. They had no remorse. They were creatures of the dark, and they were Tiavanbialis. But unlike Pisaks, the ones who had lost their mind, Rakshas were supremely intelligent. They weren't pawns. They were all dark-skinned, one of their major features, and many of their names were related to their earlier chiefs. They didn't have a god, because they believed in themselves, positing faith in war and its consequences. They didn't have armor because they didn't need it. Sarpanchji. Kalki turned towards Devdutt. There are a number of people waiting outside, he said, as he looked at the old, weak man who wouldn't be of any use to them here. You must guide them to Indravan, where you have to make them shield the entrance of the cave. They'll be protected, under the wing of Lord Indra. Devdutt nodded. May the thunder of Vajra be with you, son. He nodded at everyone and briskly exited from the room. As he did, a parrot entered from the half-open door, gliding inside. But before he could even say anything, Arjun stormed in anger. You made so many people go there to the one place where the enemies want to go. Don't you understand? Has your mind been thickened with all this religious nonsense? An unbeliever he was, Kalki knew, but the anger was so real that Kalki had to tell him the rationale behind his action. I sent them there, not to be in any god's wing, but to be standing outside in large numbers, because no matter how big the army is, they will not kill anyone on a holy land. They are Rakshas, they don't believe in what is holy. Arjun carefully settled back now, perhaps a pang of embarrassment finally breaking through his angry obstinacy. But the person who is leading them would believe in it, Kalki retorted. Bala coughed to interfere between the brothers' quarrel. And who would that be? Parrot, seize the moment and regale us with your unlimited vision of knowledge. The parrot squawked after watching everyone. Lady, lady, tall lady. Kalki got the answer. Well, we know who is leading them now. Kalki made Shuko sit over his shoulder. Arjun was still angry, while Kripa was just watching the drama around him, silently. Mates, today is not the day to fight amongst ourselves. We have to fight against them. Kalki nodded as he came to the map and began to study the in-depth cartography of Shambhala. The entrance is here. He pointed at the northeast end of the village. The pillars cover the two ends. Have we blocked the entrance? No, Bala said. But the archers are ready to hit them from far. They are Rakshas, Kripa said. Their skins are tougher than the average. An arrow made of bamboo would do little harm to them. We need to harm them repeatedly to drive them back. Bala's mouth went grim. He hadn't expected that. Look at this. Kalki's finger danced over the long conical hillsides. The two terrains, on either side, were slanting and gave way downwards. What if we bring two boulders on either side and push them down? That'll take them by surprise. Kripa studied the terrain carefully and gave a grudging smile. Not bad, just like how your brother had planned, but it won't kill many. We can block their way, perhaps, Kalki said, and harm the others. Sounds fair, Kripa said. What about the others who make past the boulder? You see, a war doesn't end in a day. It goes on for quite a few days, and so they can push and break through. We have people ready to throw your explosives, added Arjun quietly. Lakshmi had come forward, watching all the planning. Yes, they could throw it at them from the trees that we have here and there. She pointed at the forest that densely surrounded the place. Rakshas are afraid of heights, right? Those were the old times, Kripa shrugged. Many have overcome that handicap and chosen to conquer their fear. Lakshmi pursed her lips. Catapults can be used from either end, Arjun said, pointing to the opposite side of the area where the Rakshas would enter from, and come in the main circle. We can throw fire boulders at them. Kalki listened to all of those ideas. There will be no close combat, all right? Even if we wanted to, we can't. There are too many of them, and we are quite less in number. Kalki turned to Shuko. How many? Lot. That's helpful, Bud, exclaimed Bala irritatedly. How reliable are the catapults? We haven't tried them enough, Arjun admitted. They have come earlier than they were supposed to. Lakshmi said, the amount of resources we have would just last us for a day or perhaps two in the battle. Kalki shook his head. He couldn't understand how to solve the issue. Arjun, I want you to put most of the archers here on the east and a few over the terrains on the west. The south will be empty as there are only huts and they don't care about them. I would like you to send the infantry in groups of 10 to each house and scout if everyone has left for Indravan. If a Rakshas finds anyone alone in one of our homes, I want 50 men, bearing axes and swords, with Leela and Sagar leading them, Kalki concluded. That'll give us a systematic way of working rather than just ramming them forward. The question is, why haven't they entered till now? Roshan Mitra, biting his nails, asked. Kalki turned to see him. Need to get into my headspace again. Don't you all think it's kind of odd to not attack an unguarded entrance? I mean, they should be all over it. The entire room was silent. They can be getting their supplies, Woodcutter, Leela spat. Like us, they must be planning. Or, Lakshmi gasped. I read it in a book that the war doesn't start until. There was a huge bang on the door before she could complete her sentence. Kalki nodded his head, signaling to hold the thought while he went for the door. Kalki opened the door to find a tall man, with uneven teeth, perhaps half broken, standing outside with three more men. They were dark as coal, with hair that was unbelievably matted. Kalki had been in Indragarh, but he hadn't laid his eyes on the Rakshas properly, for there were next to none in the main city area. The few that were still present were in Lord Kali's employment. By the look of the Rakshas, they were exactly what he had imagined them to be, ugly and grotesque, though not imbeciles like the Mlechas. And they were tall, perhaps their average size was of Bala's height, somewhat more perhaps. A message for you from Lady Durukti, the messenger said, his voice having a thick Dakshini ring to it, as their origins were in Elam, which was south of Illavarti. Kalki opened the scroll and began to read it while Kripa just glanced at it and backed off. Bala, Leela, Sagar and the others had lined to see the scroll each, reading it again and again to comprehend what the so-called Lady Durukti had written. The messenger returned to his horse and looked at the tavern. He scoffed, and with his people, they mockingly laughed, speaking in their own dialect. It was said that the unrelentingly hot Dakshini sun made their skin so dark. Others gave it a spiritual spin by ascribing it to their sinful way of living. But even faced with the horror of their facade, Kalki knew all these tales about them being supernatural were bogus, because they were built and armed differently but were similar to Manavs, representing an entire different culture. That also means they were killable. Kalki found hope in that thought. A ghost is only scary till you see it. Then it just becomes an image. We do not wish to harm queer folks like you. We hope you choose the right decision. They all scoffed in unison. And then they rode off, their retreating horses' hooves setting into motion dust from the ground. The scroll said, either surrender now, or have a close combat duel between the two best fighters from each side. Whoever wins will seize the result without any protest. If they win, Lakshmi read it seriously, they will raid the village. If we win, they will return home. And Kalki knew who would have to go for this duel. Durupti had travelled from Indragarh to Shambhala, and it had not been an easy ride. The chariot she had travelled in had been tough. The tents were erected for rest, but it was uneven and rocky, with the sound of wild animals keeping her awake for the better part of the night. And all this while, she had talked to Chief Martanja, the paramilitary leader of the Rakshas. Unlike other Rakshas, he wasn't so tall and daunting. He had calm and a soft-spoken exterior. Durupti had all these kinds of notions about Rakshas. They were unclean, dirty and mortifying. But many of her notions had been cleared when she met them in real life. She could still recall how she was old enough to see Lord Raktapa and Kali's deal. Unlike others who didn't know how that had happened, Kali had taken help from the Dakshinis, who had even given the gift of a ship to travel to Elam and have a rich discussion with Raktapa. It had taken him a month and a lot of promises by Kali to finally let the Rakshas come on the plains of Illavarti. Raktapa was a calm person, which was surprising for Durukti, who always imagined the Rakshas to be violent. They were, in fact, great believers of Lord Shiva and had a protected temple deep in the cold regions to the north of Elam, where they would undertake a pilgrimage every year. Unlike some theories, Elam wasn't the hottest place to live. Sun killed the skin, sure, but at night the winds from the sea would soothe too. And during winters, which she had experienced while staying in Elam, there was even snow. Raktapa had said that their bodies weren't dark because of the heat, but because of their heritage. They had been born like this since time immemorial. Chief Martanja reminded her of Raktapa a lot. He had a carefree smile and a noble, broad face, with a Trishul-shaped pendant hanging around his neck. But the most noticeable feature about him was his left eye. It was stitched shut and had healed now, the skin over it having peeled back. It showed Martanja had faced death from close. When they were in the tent, examining the map of Shambhala, it was then that Durukti had asked him, "I thought your men don't wear a symbol, and yet you wear something to worship to Lord Shiva. We don't tell we love Lord Shiva. All this ink on your arms, the golden plate in the name of Lords, it's all just flimsy to us, my lady. We aren't like that. We are true believers, and this." He signaled at his chest, thumping it then with a grin. "This is our symbol. Not even this pendant, for this is just a token given by my mother. Lord Shiva is in our hearts, our soul, not in any materialistic sense." Durukti was impressed by the Brahmarakshas. The Brahmarakshas were the chiefs, mostly who were Brahmins by birth, and one of the Rakshas tribe, the most learnt and the most affluent, the most skilled of them all. When killed, the Brahmaraksha's title would be passed on to other chiefs like Martanja. When they had reached close to Shambhala, Martanja could figure out the state of the "My lady, it is surprising no one is there, it's empty. They must be hiding," she said, but her voice was drowned by the breeze blowing against the ferns, and the other Rakshas continuously training, clanging their iron spears, tossing and swinging their javelins. Durukti scanned the many red tents and horses. Simran was right behind her, afraid, almost clutching to her robe. They were so close to Soma, and yet so far. They couldn't attack just like that. With no army to face, they couldn't enter. That would be a shame and tarnish to the image of the Rakshas, who fought in valiance and in self-defense only. Martanja sent two men around to scout. They waited by the fire, as the poached bear roasted. They ate that till the scouts came back on their horses. "Chief, half of them are close to the caves, and half of them are preparing for archery. They have some kind of explosives too. They also happen to be hiding, some of them, in a local tavern," the scout said. Martanja, eating the roast bear, just nodded. Durukti shot Simran a look, who was feeding on beans. "You told me they didn't have an armory." Simran looked down in disappointment. Already exhausted, She didn't have her usual smart quips. We don't need iron for swords. Back in the south, we practiced with only bamboo, stronger than the bloody iron if you ask me, my lady, Martanja quipped thoughtfully. The estimate says there are almost 500 members, and we can't attack them at once. It'll be a foolish move and something that'll attract attention of your brother and the other tribal lords, my lady. We both don't want that as we need to do this discreetly. Durukti nodded. I don't want a bloodbath here. Shambhala is an important village for Indragarh, and Lord Vedanta would despise my brother and me if I choose to tarnish the image. But we also need to win. We can do so by honor, my lady. The best fighter from each side could come forth and battle. Whoever wins will have free access to execute their plan. Durukti thought for a while. That did make sense. I don't expect a lot from them, but they are preparing. Surely, we will be attacked preemptively if we don't send out a message. I don't want to lose my men. He sounded like a hired mercenary. Durukti had paid him a lot in gold and silver to secure his loyalty and discreetness for this expedition. So the duel sounds good. Surely, and on many levels, for they might have some tricks up their sleeves, he said, like a Vidyadhar. He mentioned the magic practitioners of the land. They used to have a tribe, but are now dispersed, and are limited to theatre shows or road shows where they awe people with their tricks. But they wouldn't be having a strong warrior like we do. Durukti scanned the Rakshas. They were all so tall and broad, it made Durukti feel small. Manavs had ordinary height as well, while the Nagas and Rakshas were all just tree-sized. Who would you send for the duel? I have Kumbh, he said, named after Lord Dashanan's brother, my lady. I hope he won't sleep a lot like your lord's brother. Durukti had read about Dashanan. While many considered him an eccentric man, he was a seeker of peace, or that's what Raktapa had portrayed him as. It was a long time back when Dashanan had come. But he had given them Elam, carving a nice island for them to stay and prosper on. Martanja laughed. Anything but that. He's quite handy. Durukti nodded, standing on her feet, for she had finished her food. At that instant, Simran also stood up. All right, but just remember one thing. The image of her weak and wounded brother, who was suffering from a debilitating disease and injury, began to choke her voice a little. We have to win. Arjun shook his head. They are mocking us. Kripa nodded. True. He moved forward looking at everyone, his hands dangling beside his body. It's like the old times, as they used to do. Best way to not end up with a lot of casualties. Whoever this lady Durukti is. Lord Kali's blood sister, Lakshmi said, while everyone turned to see how she knew this piece of information. My aunt. She works in the government, remember? Anyway, Kripa continued, she doesn't want a bloodbath, so she's choosing the less cumbersome way. In this manner, she will win because she knows we have no fighter on our side who is strong enough, while she has the strongest tribal on her side. She can freely enter with our defeat. It's good either ways, though. If we by happen chance win, then they will leave. Arjun had crossed his arms. Okay, but what is the guarantee? Mate, this is a battle. Kripa smiled cheekily. There aren't guarantees. There are only exchanged words and promises that they ought to keep with each other. Better than scavenging for bodies. If we reject this offer, Kalki said. Leela interrupted. We should reject it and fight with all our might. Kripa shook his head. Not the smartest move to make, by the way, lass. We are untrained, weak and dispersed. Right now our only hope is this combat. Can I ask how will we find someone who's as strong as that big, dark and tough man we saw right now? Roshan Mitra cleared his throat in inquiry. Everyone turned to face Bala, who arrogantly lifted up his make and grinned. But Kalki saw Lakshmi and Kripa watching him intently. And then his eyes met Arjun's, who didn't look at Bala, But at Kalki, they had a silent exchange of approval with each other. But Kalki knew he couldn't expose himself in front of Lord Kali's sister. If she knew how strong he was, what he held inside him, things would take a wholly bitter turn. They were standing opposite the Rakshas army. Kalki had agreed to the duel, but he came with his own preparations. There were people standing on the top of the terrains, invisible to the Rakshas and Lady Durukti, ready to trample them under stones, given a chance. All the archers and the swordsmen were in place, while folks with bolas were standing, ready to hurt them with the explosives. Kalki had seen the effects of it. It wouldn't kill the Rakshas, but easily wound their face or at most blind them. Lakshmi had sent a number of men to scout and see if the village was empty. Leela and Samrat were 50 yards away, on the same path that led to Indravan. Arjun and Kripa were on the eastern front, while Roshan was on the west, waiting for a volley of arrows to be shot if anything went wrong. There were a few dispersed soldiers who were standing at guard, away from the Rakshas camp. Some were on trees with their bows, while others were on bullock carts, hiding any disturbance, and they would pounce with their weapons. Most of the elders and non-volunteers were at Indravan, perhaps praying for the ones who were risking their lives to save them. Kalki and Bala were standing with two more volunteers at the back, holding axes. They didn't come prepared, but Durukti had. She brought a pack of Rakshas at the back, while she was on the horse with another woman. How did he know who Durukti was out of the two? It was because of the way she entered. She had an air about her, the way her chin was lifted up. But most of all, Kalki was surprised that she was his age, or perhaps even younger, and exceptionally pretty. The mere thought of acknowledging the enemy's beauty flustered him. He concentrated on the moment at hand. Durukti had a flamboyant golden and maroon-laced robe. Tightly clutching the horse's reins, she looked over the entire terrain, studying Kalki. He was in torn and dull clothes, unlike them. The lady next to her was perhaps Arjun's age, but not as pretty as Durukti. She was pretending to be an aristocratic woman, but something about her made him feel like she was a native, perhaps from a village. The only distinguishing feature about the girl was her 7 fingers. They said it meant she was lucky, though Kalki doubted it. What was so lucky being with a woman who wanted to destroy an innocent village? I am grateful you have accepted our combat idea. We were worried you wanted a battle. Hopefully, we have both come to a decent resolution. Durukti smiled, her voice gentle. What was she doing? Why was she being so sweet? Questions plagued him and pierced his conscience. He was worried, since the sweetest ones were also the most dangerous. This is Bala. Kalki thumped his friend's back as he came forward with his mate, frowning and huffing. Durukti nodded. Chief Martanja, she said, pointing to the one-eyed Rakshas, who was the only one wearing a breastplate amongst the other ones, call your fighter. Martanja signaled towards his men. Kalki waited for a mammoth-sized enemy from their end. Passing through the Rakshas' band of men, appeared a lanky, short man with a javelin in his hand, wearing nothing but a dhoti. He had scars lined across his dark skin, and he had little hair on his head and his body. But his face was heavily bearded. Bala looked at Kalki, and they both knew they weren't expecting this. His name is Kumbh, Durukti said, with a straight face. Kalki began to breathe a sigh of relief. Bala was a trained guardsman, and Kumbh was half his size. Bala's one slap would send him sprawling on the ground, never to get up again. Kalki heaved a sigh of relief when Bala went forward, his make ready to wreak damage. The battle spot wasn't anything to write home about. It was a gently undulating clearing near the forest, with heavily flowering shrubs on one side, and weak sunlight filtering from the tree canopies above them. The whole area smelled of dried, burning leaves and oil. Perhaps these Rakshas anointed themselves with a lot of oil as they stank of it. Kalki could see all of them glistening with oil and wearing their armors and carrying their weapons. They looked far more ready as compared to his own ragtag side. Let it begin, Durupti signaled. This was it. The circular area, where the patch of land was, became their ground for the combat. They circled each other. Kalki studied each move Kumbh made. He was walking casually, while Bala was crouched forward, legs bent, ready to lurch. That was when Bala rushed towards Kumbh ready to attack, but not with the make. He was hoping to use brute strength against Kumbh. Kumbh rolled over, dodging the attack, and coming out of the clearing. He did it in a snap of a second. Bala couldn't realize where he went. He turned around. Kumbh was there behind him. He was smirking. Kalki saw Bala now begin to use his make, twisting the handle and circling it around the top, his mouth contorting into an almighty yell as he was about to strike Kumbh. Except he struck only air. Kumbh had again escaped. He was standing behind Bala again. He could have easily climbed on top of Bala and pierced him with his weapon, but he didn't. He was savoring each such futile attack that Bala made. Kumbh's each calculated movement was a marvel of its own. He moved like a snake, slithered and rattled, dodged and swept. And unlike other Rakshas, he wasn't built well either. Rather, his arms were slim and his stomach was concave. But his face was full of vitality and energy. He was a strange enigma. Bala again went forward, but he missed each strike.